So good afternoon, good morning, good evening to everybody, and thank you very much for joining us for our second part of our webinar regarding agile innovation and upscaling, and how we can help you to unlock success in some of your product development and innovation activities, and go into more detail in terms of how we can use our external network to facilitate some of those projects. In terms of background, I am very much focusing on the product development and innovation activities. My background is in food science and technology with a strong element around project management.
Thanks for the intro, Raphaëlle. Looking back at a great part one we had 2 weeks ago, and also a personal meeting last week in Frankfurt. We'll come back to that later as well. A little bit about my personal background for those who did not join part one. We'll do a little bit of recap of the previous session for the introduction. I myself have a mechanical engineering background, quite some experience in the technical related environment, and later on as a self-employed procurement professional and supply chain expert, also joined food companies more and more, and ultimately indeed entered into the food area, the food ecosystem, and never left because I really like that. So what I would like to discuss with you today, present, of course, answer some questions from the previous part one we had exactly 2 weeks ago. That was more of an introduction, and now that was more focusing on products to market. When it comes to that, the goal for today is to have a deep dive in the actual route to market. So answering some questions from part one, I have captured the top 5, also coming out of the meetings we had together with Raphaëlle as well, but also with other professionals in Frankfurt at the Food Ingredients Trade Show last week. So, and then the route to market. Let's deep dive into, manufacturing scenarios, supply chain setup. What are the things which are relevant when coming to upscaling? Some background and tools, pitfalls and opportunities, and let's see what other topics and maybe also questions pop up, which might be interesting to tackle as well today. There is room for some questions. If there are a lot, we will capture them at the end of the webinar, but I'm convinced a lot of them will be answered along the way in this story. All right, what I just mentioned, captured the top 5 of questions coming out of previous part 1 and meetings of the Feed Trade Show last week. Perhaps you might recognize these. How long does it take the entire process to start a collaboration? Major pitfalls when engaging with manufacturers, and what will be the right moment to start looking for a producer. We'll come back to that, obviously. So how do we stay aligned also with stage gate process / PLM process? Not always applicable for startups, but if you're coming from the more corporate environment, also there you have initiatives which have a startup-like behavior, and then this could be very relevant to dive into. And of course, the question where to find my matching partner at some point. What I did is try to answer these questions in the slides coming forward. And if it's not completely answered, happy to answer them at the end or in between if it's really urgent. So about the series, content of part 2, on the left you see the content of 1, which was indeed more the product to market. What comes to it? What's the story? And what is your thought on ultimately setting up the supply chain to make your upscaling possible? Part 2 for today, the route to market. Now we're actually talking about how to get there. What type of manufacturers would you like to have? Where to find them? How to tackle that project? And that's what we are going to discuss today. A little bit of introduction again from Cibus Nexum, which is Latin for food and connection, located in the Food Valley region, close to Wageningen University in the center of the Netherlands. A few examples of our references of the couple of years that we been servicing these clients now since we launched our company 3.5 years ago. Proud of this sheet with some corporates and brands on the left side. And I think very relevant for today as well, the summary of some startups and scale-ups on the right side. And some examples of achievements of projects we have been doing in the past. Mentioned here are examples of CPG products. What we cannot disclose too much in detail are more the innovative and B2B/ingredient projects. Some references in terms of the name of the client are mentioned in the previous stage, but we can't showcase actually a project or a product like this. But this more or less explains also the process and type of projects that we can do with these typical products. All right, hand over to Raphaëlle again.
Thank you. And with this, I think the work that we do complement very well what you do, Arjen, and that's why we wanted to collaborate on this webinar, is regarding the activities that inewtrition takes on, especially focusing on product design and formulation, ensuring that all of the activities are very much aligned with consumer preferences or needs, especially looking at health and wellness through nutrition. And within that, what we do is looking at the number of different bioactive ingredients, how those can support health and wellness, or how those can be integrated into different food and beverages to have an acceptable product, not only from a consumer, but in terms of distribution, in terms of stability. There are a number of criteria that need to be taken into account. And then how do we manage those projects from ideation all the way to scale up and commercialization? And the whole objective of part 1 and part 2 is to help companies, small, medium, or big organizations that need to look at this product lifecycle management and how to maximize internal resources, internal capabilities by reaching out to external partners, whether it is from a manufacturing perspective, but also in terms of product design and scaling those activities and those projects. And as Arjen mentioned, we did go into quite a lot of detail around product to market during the first webinar, but really, how do we build this integrated value chain and supply chain so that we also increase the probability of success in terms of route to market?
Thanks, Raphaëlle. And a little bit to add to that, and innovation pipeline and portfolio management, I think it's really relevant to mention what is being discussed afterwards is related to handling a project, but in some cases, and in most cases actually, you have to zoom out to make sure, okay, this is the approach we choose for now, but zooming out, it can mean that we have to do a similar exercise again in a couple of months, years, then zooming out in terms of product and life cycle management. So when it comes to executing the projects that we are now discussing, it's more the stage gate model, phase by phase, go, no go moments. But zooming out is relevant to have a look at product lifecycle management, more broader, and then the time aspect will come as well. But we'll try to capture that as well in the coming slides. Thanks, Raphaëlle. So what we're going to discuss today are the 4 steps on this stage. Stepping into the supply chain, more specifically manufacturers/co-manufacturers, how to find on board and collaborate with the best fit partner at some point. And ultimately, once you have that, you have this handshake, how to launch, right? What comes to it? What do you need to do to achieve that? These 4 steps are mapping identically with our food flow method. And that is designed around the stage gate process. I'll come back to that later as well. So what I would like to discuss, and perhaps you can highlight a little bit about this, Raphaëlle, and then we'll jump back forward to the food flow method, which aligns with this.
So this is a visual just to represent the different stages that we usually go through when we want to develop a new product. And it seems like, this is quite a linear process, and we know that things don't always work very smoothly, along with the fact that within a lot of different ideas that may be submitted at the outset of a project, how do we identify the one that have a commercial potential and that we are going to focus on in terms of scale up and commercialization? And as much as, this can work very well, I think there are a number of different opportunities here to evaluate the business model, to evaluate the operating model, to evaluate the methodology and the tool that can be used to increase the probability of success, and also potentially look at some of those missed opportunities that may have been identified within the ideation stage and that may not have made their way to the launch phase of the project. So again, maybe a concept that we all have in our mind when we look at lifecycle management and product development. However, this webinar is going to give us a little bit of an insight how we could maybe accelerate this development, but also maximize some of those opportunities in order to maybe build the portfolio, build the brand, and also capture some of those innovative ideas, creative opportunities and concepts that might also be commercially valuable, but that may have been deprioritized during the product development activities.
Thanks, Raphaëlle. I think what I also like about the funnel, the visual of the funnel, is you have much more tolerances and freedom of movement in the beginning. And we have experiences with clients who are already, let's say, further in their journey, picking, for instance, a co-manufacturer or picking a partner, one, and then ending up in a situation where they are locked in. And that will be a topic also specifically discussed later. So going back into this funnel, you have lots more tolerances to make sure you design the process and you make sure that you have a good briefing before you actually start engaging or further developing the concept. And also what's relevant in the engagement with co-manufacturers, we'll come back to that later as well, is the feedback of those manufacturers, right? It's not something that you design from the beginning and then that's it. There's value in the feedback of manufacturers along the way. So build in some tolerance and some space to capture that feedback and make sure you use that properly as well. So that's more the outside view, and indeed, Raphaëlle, that's more complementary to the inside view. Thank you. So then jumping to the food flow method, representing these 4 steps. I will not explain it very much in detail. The essentials are, it's about designing, prepping, right? Making sure you capture all the relevant information. Draw yourself a good product and pack brief, which has all the relevant things like pricing, like allergens, like specifications, sourcing aspects, packaging, doesn't matter. But also typical things like, how does your supply chain look like? Not really the very specific and technical details, but more generic. Okay, for the next 1 year, how do I would like to upscale? For the 2nd year, for the 3rd year? That's the design thing. Second one is finding. When you have a good preparation, you know where to look and what to look for, and we'll touch that. The third part is the thing where everything comes together with trials, quality screening, negotiations, pricing, and things like that, ultimately to achieve a final handshake with a partner. And the final one is about launch. Not to forget this one, really important, because here are the devils is in the detail. Lead times on packaging materials, barcodes, who has to be on there, right? All these nitty-gritty things, which also can be a pitfall and prevent from launch. So we'll go through that. One of the questions also related to this one, common pitfalls in the engagement with co-manufacturers. And some of the results from the polls of the part 1 also come back in this summary of 7 points. There are much more, but these are really the most essential ones. And perhaps you might recognize a few of them. I think it's really important when having this funnel approach, for instance, to take into account a certain lead time towards launch, or at least know when you would like to launch and then calculate back, okay, how can I achieve that? So high expectations on lead time to launch, really assuming that you can start calling today, test tomorrow, and launch by Christmas, it's not going to work, right? It takes some time. Few of them as well, we also touched it a little bit already in part 1, expensive ingredients. So very sophisticated concepts designed around a very specific ingredient coming from the south of India with these tolerances and these specs. And then ultimately there is quite some volatility in the quality or the pricing, and you have to switch to other sources or whatsoever. Can be a huge risk. I think it's important to mention as well, these are not just pitfalls dealing with co-manufacturers. A lot of them also have to, you encounter them with having your own factory. So please keep that in mind. Talking about it, what I just mentioned on the design of the supply chain, how to set it up. It's all being determined by, who is your client? And the more you go down, the more complex it will get. A lot of startups and innovators say, I would like to go to Albert Heijn, Rewe, Carrefour, whatever. It's not always the most obvious and most feasible route to start with, especially when it comes to the claims on your pack, the demands on the design, the marketing, etc., etc. So big question mark, how to design the supply chain, all depending on what type of client do you have and what is the distribution model to get your product to these clients. So what we typically do in these exercises is just, now this is an example of one of the projects that we have been doing, but just draw the lines. What are the routes? What are the routes not only of product, but also the routes of money and the routes of documentation? And who's liable, who's reliable in this chain, right, of doing things? Would you like to prefer to manufacture the goods yourself on the semi-finished good and then ship it to a co-man for further treatment? Is there a warehouse in between? Is the supply chain frozen, chilled, ambient? Everything has an impact on, for instance, the quality and the number of products, the minimum order quantity a co-manufacturer can produce, for instance. So the more you go down, usually the more complex the supply chain will get. This is quite a simple graph of designing that, but it can be even more complex as this one. So a lot of variables and a lot of parameters and a lot of steps which take your product ultimately to the client. Secondly, is related, of course, to the supply chain setup. What would be, for me, the ideal manufacturing scenario? And there's not just one. There is quite a mixture and potential scenarios, models possible. The green ones are more or less the co-manufacturing models on collaborating with the manufacturer. The top ones are related to, well, of course, do everything yourself, right? Build your own factory, from develop to distribute, it's all yours. The simple variance is co-packing, just outsource, let's say, the packing or the repacking of your product, and then going to tolling, a little bit of processing, send it back, nothing exciting. But then it starts, right, on the preparation or even the sourcing of ingredients. Is it something you would like to do yourself and remain to do that? Or could we use the buying power of manufacturers as well for typical ingredients, for instance, which they can combine with other recipes? Perhaps they have very good contracts and stock positions with some suppliers. And on the bottom you see some options of fully outsourced to one co-manufacturing, and let's say the ultimate variance of co-manufacturing is outsourcing with a partnership in a joint venture or a license fee. And in part one, we have mentioned an example of such a license fee construction between Mondelez and Arla for the production of plant-based drinks. So, still in the design phase of the project, these are three boxes which are relevant to capture in the preparation. So three major questions. What do I want? And that has to do with perhaps sustainability, the business case, a certain margin. Of course, what do you need? So what do you need from the manufacturer / co-manufacturer? And what else will be important, right? It has to be a good supply chain. It has to be chilled. We have legal issues. We have certain service level agreement challenges with our client on our end. Don't forget, it's not, let's say, your key or unique selling point, but without that, you can't achieve your goal. You can't supply your client. So these are mainly the three blocks, the three chapters on a product briefing. Coming to the first poll in our webinar today, your personal experience with reaching out to co-manufacturers. Please hit it, Siobhan. Thank you. What do you think, Siobhan? Can we publish the results?
We've got two winners. Number one is actually excited while they're actually interested in my concept. And the third one, which is they responded but are too busy to deal with my request.
Okay. Both, well, one on the positive side, one on the negative side. And the first one I think is really interesting because when engaging with them and not, for instance, having a proper pitch, that could be a challenge, right? If you just start calling, but if you're well prepared, then it might be actually really excited for them. You always have to know, okay, what is the question behind? What's the question? What's in it for me from the manufacturer side? But we'll come back to that. But it's good to know that there's actual interest. The other hand also is also in our experience, even when we do projects and we have prepared a proper pitch and have a fantastic introduction prepared, well, we also experience they never reply, right? But also too busy to deal with my request. And too busy, that can mean on manufacturing side, but also, for instance, already earlier on the R&D side. Because when scaling up, they have to assess the topic, they have to assess the product. And there can be a limitation on their R&D resources, not on sales, not on production, but just for the technical people to have a look at your concept. So although they might be interested, still there can be a challenge afterwards on the interest when it comes to available time. So jumping then to the scouting process itself, because it really comes down to making sure you pitch your concept the same way like you would like to do to Albert Heijn, to your client, right? Make sure to have an attractive proposition, to have a good discussion. So what does the process look like on the actual scouting and engagement for co-manufacturers? There are some topics mentioned here on the market research, for instance. The geography, of course, determine where you would like to have a co-manufacturer. The type of supplier when it comes to their equipment or perhaps their storage facilities, or is it a big company with high quality, with high quantities, more focusing on private label production, or is it a shared facility which has also food grade equipment in place? And of course, you can rely on certain sources and databases and channels. I mentioned some at the end of the presentation, which you can use on trying to scout for potential partners, visit some exhibitions maybe. One topic as well on the geography of finding manufacturers. In some cases, or in a lot of cases, clients approach us with the question, okay, we would like to have a manufacturer, for instance, in the Netherlands. My first question would be, why only in the Netherlands? Why not reach out a little bit further? It's still one-day drive to Amsterdam, for instance, and then you have a lot of more options and possibilities. Could also be the barrier of culture/language, but there's no boundary, let's say, in terms of borders, because it's all EU and the trading and shipment is quite easy. So the second part in scouting is the RFI, the request for information. The purpose of this is to establish a filtered long list, to make sure that we have a selection of companies that we gather through our exercise and our research, to make a list. Well, not everybody has to do 90% of, let's say, the criteria or the requirements. It doesn't matter. That's for later concern. So what we will do as well can be a consideration to have this exercise done anonymously. I think 90% of our projects, we do it anonymously. So the name of the client, details of the recipe will not be shared with the market, only after having an NDA in place, for instance. I made a remark here on supplier feedback. I think this is a really relevant one. Once we started with the right proper product briefing as a preparation for the search, that's quite into detail. But deliberately, we would like to approach the market with a more open mind. So then we are also open to receive the feedback of suppliers. And if you're, let's say, approaching them with a too strict set of specifications and requirements, they quite quickly can say, okay, no, we don't have this, we don't comply with that, it's done. So having a little bit more of a broad description enables you to capture the experience and the feedback of these companies. And then you might discover, for instance, in the meantime, there are completely other processing steps available for instance, quality, or the shelf life extension, instead of, for instance, a heating step. And that could, let's say, trigger you to get back to the drawing table and say, okay, wow, this is interesting. We have to expand our search perhaps to other ones or other regions as well. Final stage is the RFP, which is the request for proposal. Then the commercial discussions will start. And then you also have to make a split between what is really a need to have or a nice to have. NDAs will be in place to exchange information, to secure confidentiality. And that's also the stage where samples are being shared and we share quotations and start negotiating. So it's not about sending an email to a co-manufacturer asking them for their price on conversion cost of 1 kilogram. Doesn't work. There comes a lot more to it. They have to know a lot more parameters and information on providing a proposal if they want to provide a proposal. So finding, all right, where to find it? Considerations in the region are related to, of course, the proximity to yourself, but also to the client. Not forget that, because if you're based, for instance, in the Netherlands, and you would like to service a client in, a retail client, for instance, in Germany, it makes sense to find a producer who has already, for instance, distribution channels or connections with those end clients in a chilled or perhaps frozen supply chain, or at least has connections with 3PL companies, third-party logistics providers, which have already, let's say, for instance, EDI routes and the delivery routes to these clients. So shelf life is also an important one. If it's shelf stable and you have, let's say, a shelf life of 1 year or 1.5 years, you can also get your product out of Italy, and because the shipping time doesn't matter anymore. So then it's more about the efficiency and the cost, maybe, on the production of the product itself. So sustainability can also be a part of it. And a good example is one of our clients is Tony Cashew. They're shipping their peanuts directly from Tanzania to Europe for further production and selling, instead of through the obvious route via Vietnam all over the world. Shortening the supply chain, reducing carbon footprint can also be a very important consideration for your manufacturing setup. And then engaging with a co-manufacturer, then the interesting part starts, right? Then they start asking questions. And from our experience, the three most important, there are a lot of more, but the most important question they will start asking is, of course, volumes, right? They want to know, related to their equipment, their layout, what is the volume that we have? The second one is the recipe and the process. And that is also related to the setup internally of how they can manage your product, your concept in their factory. Has to do with allergens, has to do with, do they already use certain ingredients which can be replaced? And of course, have to take into account, it could be that they are looking for ways to, from efficiency perspective, match your idea or your concept with one of their own, to see if they can find an optimum in their supply chain, in their production or storage. The other one is time to market, and that has to do with, for instance, production slots, availability of R&D people, and it can easily take a month, right, to have a first lab trial, and then start discussions on industrial trial, and then start discussions on launch, and before you know it will be 6 months, 9 months. So the time to market is essential, and once it's about a product which is not completely delivered, let's say, into the detail, completely designed, and not already completely prepared to start the production with, then it can take a little bit more time for them to adapt and to make sure it fits with their internal production. And in the middle of things, it's that sort of golden egg on production cost / conversion cost. If you have a good mix, so a good volume with not so many SKUs, a good recipe, and, well, not a too quick time to market, there is, let's say, the sweet spot when it comes to the optimum in pricing. Nevertheless, you have to take into account that when a startup or new food innovation, initial volumes, ramp-up volumes are quite low. So the cost price, initial cost price, related to the usage of ingredients, the conversion cost, and the waste will cause a higher price in the beginning. It's important also to calculate, let's say, not only for the first year, but also for the second year. So do some modeling. Once the volumes are increasing, what is the impact on the waste level? It can go down. What is the impact on the efficiency of production? That goes up. For instance, our recommendation in the beginning could be start with a less number of SKUs, right? To make the process less complex. The initial volume will be interesting for the manufacturer for every product. And then later on, when you have more traction, you might increase the number of SKUs. And then it becomes more attractive for the manufacturer as well. All right, then the third stage is all about onboarding. We can distinguish 3 chapters here. It's all about the technical part, commercial part, and quality. Technically, we mean we have to have a step of lab trials internally with the manufacturer because they have to mimic the process and prepare it for their internal industrialized environment. And then the following steps could be the trials. It's also possible in between that once they have a pilot line, for instance, you can have preliminary samples. And if this pilot line is food grade, you can use those samples, for instance, for consumer trials, consumer testing, even before you have industrial trials at bigger volumes. So that could be an opportunity once you are having a, let's say, urge to go to market, or you would like to provide some samples to a festival or something like that, or do a trial with a retailer, to have a very good first round of small pilot scale trials, which is really, let's say, heading up to the industrial level, but also suitable for human consumption, food grade. Of course, at the end, we end up with industrial trials to prepare for the first production run. On the commercial part, and I'll come back to these topics later on after a few slides, we have also, let's say, negotiations, discussions about contracts, about all the details when it comes to collaboration, discussions about the cost breakdown, the risk breakdown. And this is really a relevant part in the onboard stage. Not just ask for a price, because a price doesn't tell something, right? It's captured in the ingredients are in there, the waste is in there, the packaging, the conversion, the risk, the energy. You don't have a good picture on what is happening behind the scenes, especially when circumstances change. And if you have just a price, let's say €1.50 for a jar of peanut butter, or €5 for a kilogram of protein, you're not, let's say, well prepared for the future when circumstances changes. And circumstances can mean the sourcing of the ingredient, but also in the factory itself. Then the third part is quality. First, you can start with the screening remotely on the documentation, on the certifications they have. Are they still valid? Are the right ones in place? Has to do, of course, also with the end client. And then we have the quality part when it comes to approving the final recipe once the trials are being successful. And you can then draw up your final declaration to be put on your packaging, etc. And of course, there is a part of an audit / site visit, part of the quality chapter. Related to the previous slide, this was something I repeated from the previous part, Raphaëlle, especially about the market test and evaluation, right? Once we have what I just mentioned on the pilot scale, and that is the part here at the middle of the slide, that could be an opportunity to already say, okay, once this trial is successful at pilot scale, we can use that for consumer preference testing and have already a little bit of an iteration earlier to the market instead of waiting for an industrial scale. Okay, on a little bit more on details on the trials itself. Step 1, supplier lab test / R&D support. And I mentioned the abbreviation CRO, which refers to contract research organization. So that could be the level where you might use a partnership with such a company to provide lab samples. Then a step further, pilot line, maybe food grade for consumer tests, could be, let's say, the CDMO, so that's a contract development and manufacturing organization, or just repeating production runs is a contract manufacturing. And if you just end up with a company who has no R&D, like a CMO, it's all about providing your product, and then it's a CDMO. There's no D in it, right? There's no development support in there. I put these names just in reference, because if it depends on your product, what type of company you're looking for. And if you have to do all these 3 steps, the CMO doesn't work. You have to have a CDMO because they have to support you in step 1, 2, and 3. But if you say, okay, I come with my product, I only want to recurring production runs, start off with a big industrial trial right away without any R&D preparation, a CMO will do the job. The final step could be a shelf life test as well. Then on commercial, there's one thing I would like to highlight in the onboarding phase is it could be an option to end up with a letter of intent, which is not a final contract, but just the essentials captured in, let's say, 4 or 5 pages, where you do have a handshake, you do have an agreement on the most important topics for both parties at that moment, but the most important clause of this letter of intent is the possibility to escape from both sides. And then I refer to the stage gate model again. In the case, the trial is okay, the price is good, but for whatever reason, the project will be killed, and your end client is quitting the project, it will not happen anymore, then we can jump out of this letter of intent. And then the supplier says, okay, yeah, we have done some trials, okay, that's a pity, you have to pay for it. But if a letter of intent is in place, both parties can jump out of it. If we have a go, and this would then perfectly align, the split between onboard and launch would perfectly align with the stage gate go, no go model on the business case towards your end client, for instance. If there is a go with you and your client, then you can translate that also to the relationship with your manufacturer and go on with final contract negotiations in the final stage. I think this is a good example of how your engagement with co-manufacturing setup could be beneficial related to a stage gate or a product lifecycle process. So that's about the advantage. There are some disadvantages as well on the letter of intent, of course. Happy to help if there are any questions on that. Another topic which is relevant on commercial, what I earlier mentioned as well, please make sure you get a sufficient level of detail of the cost components in your product. So don't accept the price of €1.50 of a jar. Make sure you know what's happening behind the scenes, right? The price of the raw materials, the price of the packaging materials, and the conversion, and not just the conversion, also the storage cost, the freezing cost, for instance, the risk and margin, and all these things. Some companies don't want to share their margin. Don't worry, other ones will. Yeah? So yeah, if you have something to compare on pricing of the raw materials, the pack, and the conversion, then at some point you know from all the companies what is roughly their margin. And to be honest, I don't care about margins. That's their policy. If they have a better score on the efficiency of their conversion and have a very good buying power on raw materials, that could level out perhaps. But please make sure you have enough information and trust also to have this build up. It's also a matter of trust, right? If a co-manufacturer is willing to share this or not. On the horizontal levels, you see the different cost components. Vertically, you also have the differences in batch size. And for instance, I mentioned here 6,000 kilogram batch and 12,000. That could mean that increasing the batch size will lower your waste level. And don't be surprised that starting off with a low volume as a startup, your waste level could easily go up to 15 to 20% of your raw material input. And that's quite a lot. So initially, the startup volumes could mean you will not be, let's say, making profit because of the high waste level. And this is one of the reasons why we could advise in the beginning to lower the number of SKUs, increase the batch size at manufacturers to make sure the waste level is kept as low as possible. So this cost breakdown is not only meant to put a knife, let's say, on the co-manufacturer and make sure that they provide the information. No, it's also to manage risk and volatility. And how to know what the impact is on a price change, for instance, of your material in the final cost calculation. And then I think an important topic is all about the topic of risk.
That's certainly an area where I think there are a lot of learnings to compile and to gather. And instead of looking at those later on in the project, having a good risk register that is developed at the outset and reviewed on regular occasions, probably part of the stage gate process, for example, where we evaluate the risk and we agree on mitigation and contingency, and how we can mitigate those, again, by reaching out to partners like inewtrition or Cibus Nexum to address those at the outset and throughout the project. So I think you spoke about that, Arjen, already in many different ways, but what are the risks associated with the supply chain, or maybe the supply of the product, or the demand as well on the other side, as we can see here on this slide? From a process perspective, again, what are the variables, what are the parameters that are at play here, and how we can address those? And what are the controlling mechanisms that we have in place to evaluate those risks and to, again, mitigate those risks? And within the bigger framework, again, in terms of environmental risk and how potentially this could impact either the product or the project, but also our consumer. And I think, that's an area where I haven't seen many organizations address that very effectively, and how this should really be integrated as part of the project management activities, really looking at the cross-functional team where all of the different disciplines can contribute and be part of those risk management, risk analysis, risk assessment of the activities.
Yeah, thanks, Raphaëlle. For time purpose, I think we focus on the supply and the processing risk. On the demand side, not so much today, but we have covered a little bit, let's say, on the geography and the type of the client. Let me start with a poll, and I changed this question to the biggest concerns. And if you don't have them, if you do have them already, please mention your biggest experiences, could be in a negative point of way, with supply chain risks. And this is more or less focusing on the part of manufacturing, not so much on upscaling, but more in general on manufacturing. Could be a product you're already having in launch, or entering into engagement with co-manufacturers. Can you share with us the results, Siobhan, on the poll?
Yes, so we have a very clear winner with 58% concerns about raw materials, availability and quality, and the second biggest concern is around processing, so MOQs or MPQs, capacities and capabilities.
Yeah, and that's interesting because these two are actually the things related to innovations itself and where these companies are, right? Because they don't know yet a lot about what happens later on when it comes to the performance and the actual quality. I think those topics are also underestimated, let's say, grip on price and performance. So I'm not surprised about the outcome, because the raw material and the processing are so closely related to what people already know. And that is exactly what we need in these type of discussions. Also open up the discussions about price, performance, and the quality. Those concerns are very valid, right? They are real and they are also happening. And I think it's important to, what I just mentioned, to have the total mix, and certain tools and, short conversations can help to tackle a lot of them and to make sure you're well prepared, or at least that once an issue is popping up, you know how to handle it, or okay, for now it's a problem, but maybe not for half a year or a year after. Great, thank you. Perhaps you can mention a few examples of this, Raphaëlle, which is really relevant in this area.
Correct. So this is looking at it maybe even bigger overview as what we've seen earlier, highlighting the importance of the risk register and how we can look at it in terms of product, in terms of route to market, but even from a business standpoint, how all of those aspects of product development, lifecycle management, innovation should really be brought together into a very cohesive activity that has to be really carefully assessed and managed throughout the project. And here we can see that some of those we may be able to mitigate or address directly. Others, may need to be a lot less within our control. However, I think it's our duty to ensure that they are still addressed and discussed, so that there is a different course of action that might need to be undertaken throughout the project, another, I suppose, lessons learned is how activities change so quickly throughout the course of a project and all of those innovation activities, that people who work in product development and innovation should always keep their finger on the pulse, but also be willing to take a different trajectory as the project evolves. And for me, one of the biggest lessons learned is having this risk register very carefully managed, and also being willing to review some of those assumptions and some of those risks which can impact. So, having this kind of agile innovation, not only mindset, but also around the skill set and the tools and the methodology that are being used to address those effectively and in what I call real time. So, within inewtrition, we have developed a number of different tools so that we can look at the risk on a regular basis with the most current and relevant information that are available at any point of time.
Thank you, Raphaëlle. I think doing an hazard analysis or risk analysis at some point is relevant. And it's important to say, indeed, there is a time aspect to that because things change. And not only from your project perspective, but also from the environment. For instance, natural hazards or volatility in price, volatility in the quality and availability of raw materials. A lot of things can change, and be prepared for those potential changes. Build in tolerances, build in mitigation. And we don't need very corporate procedures to do that. No, we come from that, right? We know the environment and how it's taking place and how it's being handled, but we have quite sophisticated but also very lean models to tackle these risks. All right, thanks, Raphaëlle. We'll go on, and I would like to dive into the mitigation and contingency of a couple of these risks related to a slide of the previous part 1, because then we stepped into the details of what is behind, for instance, the world of the example where we had there on roasted peanuts, like the harvesting, the trading, the processing, and what are all the components at the lowest level which influence at some point in time or some point in the levels above the total price or the total risk. And like, for instance, the results of the crop or the currency of the trading, the raw materials are being traded in dollars or whatever. So what measures can you take to manage that? Or if you don't measure it and you don't want to mitigate it, build in some tolerance, and then you're at least prepared for if something happens. Then on the quality part, so we have covered a little bit the risk on the quality part. The objectives are in the onboard phase, in parallel also to doing these trials, screen audit, make sure the supplier is ticking the boxes and is helping you, not only helping you, but also your client. And after the successful trials, then it's time to wrap up and to make sure the recipes are being finalized, specifications are being drawn up. Also make sure the supplier is doing that, right? They have to share with you the proper documentation, the specifications, all kinds of data sheets and things like that. Special protocols which are being taken care of in the processing specifically for your product. And ultimately, we have to have a quality agreement in place which covers the most relevant things and procedures and documentation of the supplier. That's necessary for your own process, because if you are having a certificate like B Corp, like IFS, broker, or something like that, you have to comply with certain things as well, and you may forward that to your supplier. And then capturing some quality standards which are there in the market, a lot of them, and sometimes they apply, sometimes they don't, or an interesting mix of that. And besides quality standards, you also have some claims. And this is an interesting part. I think we can organize a complete masterclass of several days about claims, about what can be in the product, nutritional values, what can be on the label or not. But these are some examples of what you are willing to claim or need to claim on your pack when it comes to the USPs of your product. All right, the final chapter in launch, it's all about finalize collaboration, set up the detailed supply chain and arrange everything that is needed and tick the box on the final quality steps documentations, contractual obligations, and things like that. Just to capture the relevant part of the... I don't want to underestimate the relevance of the launch, but concerning the time, I think it's relevant to skip this one for now. So some key topics which are very important to have in your final contract, like the ordering process, IP stuff, exclusivity agreements, right, for certain markets and channels and so on, how to handle upstream sourcing of pack and raw materials. And when it comes to some sourcing and information, you might well reach out to the companies mentioned here when it comes to market developments on pricing, on risk, on whatsoever. And I think an important slide for today, the key takeaways, capturing it in faster, better, and cheaper. Speed is key, but it has to be agile, right? Don't forget anything, but do it efficiently. I think it's also important to say that spend some time in the beginning on really thinking through your process and your concept, and then start running. Proper preparation is key in this case. Cheaper as well. If you skip the capex part, you don't have to invest in your own stainless steel. You save your budget for a well-prepared strategy. So make sure together we will circumvent the pitfalls that we have already experienced. Okay. I see here one on the reasonable margins in calculations from the cost of goods sold of manufacturers. What are reasonable margins? There is not just one answer to that. It depends on their calculating model. We have experienced that a very old-fashioned dairy manufacturer in the Netherlands has a very rough calculation of their cost internally, of the raw materials and the pack materials, and then all of a sudden he puts on 50%. I don't know why 50%. It's covering the risk, it's covering the heat, it's covering the personnel. And I always would like to challenge that, because if you put on 50% and the raw material price increases, you earn additional money on a problem that occurs. And that's so frustrating. So I think just a general markup of 50%, it doesn't work. A fixed margin, however, that would work, because then you could have a discussion on what's happening behind on the different components. Some co-manufacturers, they are having a gross margin, a fixed gross margin, and that is covering then the cost for overhead, for conversion, for storage and things like that. And they only split out the cost of raw material and certain processing steps. It's depending on the financial model of a co-man. And then it's becoming interesting to, if you have your own model, to properly compare them with each other. All right, the other question is on the co-manufacturing markup on raw materials. Yes, it is quite common that co-manufacturers apply a certain margin on the purchase of raw materials. And that has to do with the handling, that has to do with the storage, the insurance, it has to do with taking care of a product which is maybe not theirs, but still they have to process that. They have certain risk around it. So it's totally reasonable that they add, let's say, 5 or 10% to, let's say, taking care of your recipes or additional recipes. But also don't underestimate the power, their buying power of their ingredients, because if they combine certain components of your concept with their own ingredients, you might end up with a lower price and a better stock position and a better efficiency in the case they can handle it for you. So yes, it is common that they make a markup on purchasing raw materials, or they can include it separately in their cost calculation, for instance, in the part of insurance and storage. We have a question on the quality standards. What do you think on the IFS certification from an outsourcing partner? I think this is quite a general question. I think IFS is relevant, but only in the case you have to supply to retail. If you're having a product to a business-to-business or a food service client, most of the time IFS is not required, or BRC is not required. Well, I hope it was successful also for the audience to have this story and to learn about the world behind innovation and upscaling in an agile way. So thank you also for hosting this, Raphaëlle and Siobhan, for the support, and Declan as well.
Yeah, and I know we're probably a little bit short in time now, Arjen, but thank you so much for going through the details, the complexity, the overview of how innovation can be agile and how to evaluate some of those risks, but also opportunities and solutions to build differentiated brands and successful businesses. So thank you very much for that. And certainly a big thank you as well to Declan and Siobhan at the back end to help us to coordinate and execute this webinar, and to our audience as well for being with us for part 2. We would really welcome the questions that we can address afterwards. Thank you.
Enjoy.
Take care.
Thanks.
Bye-bye now. Enjoy the rest of your day. Cheers. Bye.